I still don't know how to explain what happened. Maybe I never will. But if you're reading this, I need you to believe me, every word of it. It started on a regular Tuesday. My wife, Emily, and I had just gotten off work. We always took turns picking up our son, Ethan, from school, but that day, it was my turn. The drive there was the same as always, passing through quiet suburban streets, the same red light at the corner where I always got stuck, the same stretch of road lined with oak trees that cast long shadows in the late afternoon. It was early fall, and the air had that crisp scent of dried leaves and the faint smokiness from distant bonfires. When I pulled up to the school, parents were already gathered outside, chatting idly while their kids ran around. The sun hung low, casting everything in a golden glow. I parked, stepped out, and walked up to the usual pickup area where Ethan always waited. He was supposed to be there, standing near the bench like always, probably fidgeting with the straps of his backpack. But he wasn't. A cold prickle ran down my spine. I scanned the area, looking for his messy brown hair, his blue hoodie, anything familiar. And then I saw him, standing a few feet away from the main group of kids, almost hidden behind the brick wall near the school entrance. He wasn't moving. Just standing there. Staring. I called out, "Ethan." No reaction. A second of hesitation, and then I walked over. Maybe he was lost in thought or sulking about something. Kids had moods, after all. "Hey, buddy, let's go." I put a hand on his shoulder. That's when I felt it. His whole body was tense, stiff, like he wasn't a kid but something pretending to be one. Then, finally, he turned to me. And for a split second, I felt something was off. His face looked the same, freckles across his nose, the tiny scar on his eyebrow from when he fell off his bike last summer. But his eyes, they were empty. Not in the normal way when a kid is zoned out, but hollow, like he was looking through me rather than at me. I shook off the feeling. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe I was imagining things. "Come on, let's go," I said again, guiding him toward the car. The entire walk there, he didn't say a word. That wasn't normal. Ethan was always chatty after school, rambling about his day, what his friend Lucas did, what snack he wanted when we got home. But this kid, this version of Ethan, was silent. Emily was waiting for us when we got home. Our house was a typical suburban place, 2 stories, white siding, a big oak tree in the front yard. Our golden retriever, Cooper, barked excitedly as we walked in. But when Ethan stepped inside, Cooper froze. His tail, which had been wagging just moments before, stiffened. He lowered his head and let out a low, uneasy growl, backing away toward the kitchen. Emily frowned. "What's wrong with him?" I had no answer. Ethan, or the thing that looked like him, just stood there, staring at the dog with the same unsettling stillness he had at school. Then, without a word, he turned and walked upstairs. No greeting. No request for a snack. No complaints about homework. Just silence. Emily and I exchanged a glance. "He's acting weird," she murmured. "Yeah," I admitted. Upstairs, I heard Ethan's bedroom door creak open. Then, soft footsteps. Then, nothing. For a long time, nothing. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last normal moment in our house. That night was when everything really started. Ethan, or whatever had come home with us, barely spoke during dinner. He sat at the table, staring at his plate, mechanically moving his fork but never actually eating. His favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs, sat untouched, the steam curling up in the kitchen light. "Ethan?" Emily asked, her voice light but concerned. "You're not hungry?" Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and for a second, I swore I saw something behind them, something calculating. "I'm fine," he said, finally. His voice was wrong. Not completely different, but slightly off, like someone doing an impression of him. A fraction of a second too slow, too deliberate. Emily forced a smile. "Okay, buddy. But if you're feeling sick, let us know, alright?" He didn't respond. Just nodded. After dinner, he excused himself and went upstairs without brushing his teeth, without asking for dessert. That wasn't like him. Ethan always tried to stall bedtime, begging for 5 more minutes of TV, trying to sneak an extra cookie. But tonight? Nothing. Emily and I sat in the dimly lit living room, the soft hum of the dishwasher the only sound filling the space. "He's not himself," she whispered, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I know," I admitted. "Maybe he's just tired." But deep down, I knew this wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't normal. Then, just after midnight, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, a soft thump from upstairs. Then another. A rhythmic pat, 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 like footsteps. But not normal ones. These were too quick, too erratic, as if someone was pacing, or running. Emily stirred beside me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered groggily. "Yeah," I said, already sitting up. The house was dark except for the faint blue glow from the hallway nightlight. I stepped out of bed and crept toward Ethan's room. The door was open. I peered inside. Ethan wasn't in bed. Instead, he was standing in the middle of his room. Barefoot. His pajamas were slightly wrinkled like he hadn't laid down all night. And he was moving. Not walking. Not pacing. But shifting, jerky, unnatural movements, his limbs twitching in a way that made my stomach turn. His head would tilt sharply to the side, then snap back. His fingers twitched like he was playing an invisible piano. His feet barely left the floor as he moved, but there was this unsettling speed to it, like his body was fighting itself. A chill ran down my spine. "Ethan?" I called softly. He stopped. Froze. Then, slowly, too slowly, he turned his head to look at me. Not the way a child looks at their parent. The way a predator sizes up prey. His eyes gleamed in the dim light. Wide. Empty. A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. But it wasn't a child's smile. I swallowed hard. "Why are you awake?" For a second, he just stood there. Then, in a whisper barely louder than a breath, he said, "I don't sleep." I felt my blood turn to ice. Before I could say anything else, he turned away and crawled back into bed, laying down stiffly, his arms resting at his sides like a corpse in a coffin. I backed out of the room, forcing myself to breathe. My hands were shaking. I climbed back into bed beside Emily, but I didn't sleep. Not that night. Because all I could hear, faintly, from the darkness of the hallway, was the soft pat, 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 of tiny feet running again. The next morning, I felt like a zombie. I must have dozed off at some point, but it couldn't have been for more than an hour. My head pounded, my limbs were heavy, and my stomach was twisted into a nervous knot. Emily looked just as bad. She kept rubbing her arms, a deep crease between her eyebrows. "Did you hear him last night?" she asked, voice low. I nodded. "He was running around." She swallowed hard. "I got up at some point. I was going to check on him, but I don't know, I didn't." Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were afraid of our own child. Then, Ethan walked into the kitchen. And he was smiling. Not a normal, tired morning smile, but a huge grin, stretched too wide. Like he was trying to show every single one of his teeth. It sent a ripple of cold fear through my gut. "Good morning," he said. His voice was different again. Lighter. Sing-song. But hollow underneath, like it wasn't his. Emily forced a smile. "Morning, buddy." He sat at the table, still grinning. His eyes flicked between us. Watching. Studying. Then he did something that made my skin crawl. He picked up his spoon. Not to eat, but to hold it up to his face, staring at his own reflection in the curved metal. His head tilted side to side, slow, deliberate movements as if he was testing his own expression. Like he wasn't sure how to move his own face. My stomach clenched. "You feeling okay, bud?" I asked carefully. Ethan lowered the spoon and just stared at me. His grin faded slightly. "I feel fine," he said, voice flat. I forced myself to eat, but my appetite was gone. Emily barely touched her food, too. And then, after breakfast, Ethan went outside. That's when things got worse. The dead things started appearing. Emily was cleaning up the kitchen when she glanced out the window. Her whole body went rigid. "Honey." Her voice was thin, strained. I put my coffee down and followed her gaze. Ethan was in the backyard. He was crouched down in the grass, completely still. At first, I thought he was playing with something. But then I noticed the way his hands were curled, tensed, like claws. His head was tilted, his breath shallow. And then I saw what he was looking at. A dead bird. A small, gray sparrow, lying on its side. And Ethan was just staring at it. Not with curiosity. Not with sadness. Just watching. Emily took a shaky breath. "I'm going out there." I grabbed her arm. "Wait." She looked at me with wide, scared eyes. I swallowed. "Let's just see what he does." We stood at the window, unmoving. After a long, eerie moment, Ethan reached out, slowly, and picked up the bird. His fingers curled around its tiny body, his grip too tight. Its little head lolled to the side. Then, with no hesitation, he put it in his pocket. My stomach turned. Emily let out a sharp breath. I shoved the door open. "Ethan." He turned to me, hand still in his pocket, gripping the bird. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He blinked. "Nothing." I held out my hand. "Give me what's in your pocket." He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw something cross his face. Something angry. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the dead bird. He held it out to me like an offering. I forced myself not to recoil as I took it, feeling the small, stiff weight in my hand. "You can't pick up dead animals, buddy," I said carefully. That's not okay." He just stared at me. No remorse. No reaction. "Go inside," I said. He obeyed immediately, walking past me, brushing against my arm as he went. His skin was ice cold. Emily was shaking when I got back in. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered. I had no answer. The night gets worse. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I didn't care how insane it looked. I didn't care if Ethan noticed. Every instinct in my body told me that something was wrong. That this thing in our house was not our son. And then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. The room was silent. Too silent. Then I heard it. A faint scratch, scratch, scratch. My breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the hallway. From just outside our door. I reached over and shook Emily awake. She stirred, groggy, but when she heard the sound, she went stiff. We both held our breath. Then, a voice. Soft. Almost playful. "Why is your door locked?" Ethan's voice. I gripped the blankets, my heart hammering in my chest. He didn't knock. He didn't try to open the door. He just stood there. For what felt like forever. Then, finally, the soft pat, 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 of his feet retreating. I didn't sleep. Neither did Emily. And the next morning, when I stepped into the hallway, I saw it. Something was sitting in front of our door. A dead squirrel. Its body twisted. Its eyes gone. And I knew, deep in my gut. Ethan had left it for US.by the fourth day. Emily and I were barely speaking. Not because we were mad at each other, but because we didn't know what to say. We were exhausted, terrified, and trapped in a waking nightmare with something that looked like our son but wasn't. Ethan barely slept. Every night, he'd move. We'd hear his quick, erratic footsteps running up and down the hallway, stopping outside our door. Sometimes, he'd whisper things. Nonsense. Words we couldn't understand. Sometimes, he'd laugh. But it wasn't a child's laugh. It was something else. The dead things keep appearing. The morning after the squirrel, we found more. A rabbit, left on the front steps. Its body was cold, stiff. Its fur matted with something dark. Emily refused to touch it. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, her whole body trembling. "I can't do this," she whispered. I grabbed a shovel from the garage and scooped it up, swallowing back nausea as I carried it into the woods behind our house. And the whole time, I felt him watching me. When I turned back toward the house, Ethan was standing in the window. Staring. His lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. And I knew, without a doubt, he had done this on purpose. The incident at school. That day, I took him to school myself. I needed normalcy. I needed something to feel like our old life. But it didn't. The teacher, Ms. Carter, gave me a look when I dropped him off. A concerned one. "Everything okay at home?" she asked carefully. My stomach tightened. "Why?" She hesitated. Then she glanced at Ethan, who was standing by the classroom door, completely still, his head slightly tilted like he was listening to us. Ms. Carter lowered her voice. "He's been different. He doesn't play with the other kids anymore. He just watches them. And yesterday, at lunch, he bit another child." My breath caught in my throat. "Bit?" I repeated. She nodded, her expression grim. "Hard. Broke skin." When we asked him why he did it, he said. She trailed off, looking suddenly uneasy. "What?" I pressed. Ms. Carter glanced at Ethan again. Then, barely above a whisper, she said. "He said he wanted to know what she tasted like." My whole body went cold. I turned to Ethan, who was still standing by the door. And I swear to God, he winked at me. The bathroom incident. That night, Emily broke down. She was standing in the upstairs hallway, gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles were white. Tears streaked her face, and she was shaking. "I saw him," she whispered. I rushed over. "What happened?" She took a deep, unsteady breath. "I got up to pee. I didn't turn the light on, I didn't want to wake myself up too much. But when I washed my hands, I saw it." "Saw what?" She looked at me, her face pale. "Ethan. Standing in the bathtub." I felt my stomach drop. "He was just there," she continued, voice shaking. "Standing in the dark. Not moving. Not blinking. Just staring at me." I swallowed hard. Did he say anything? A long, terrified pause. Then, she nodded. "Yeah." I braced myself. "What did he say?" Emily's lips trembled. "He said, 'I don't like the way you smell.'" I stared at her. She let out a shaky breath, gripping my shirt. "I don't know what's in that room, but it's not our son." I had no idea how to respond. Because deep down, I already knew she was right. By the fifth night, neither Emily nor I could pretend anymore. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't some strange childhood phase. Something was wrong with Ethan. Or, whatever was pretending to be Ethan. The dark spot on the ceiling. That evening, Emily and I were in the living room. We weren't talking. Just sitting there, locked in our own silent terror. Ethan had gone upstairs after dinner without a word. He didn't say goodnight. He never did anymore. I stared at the floor, thoughts racing. Then I noticed something. A dark stain on the ceiling. It was faint, just above where Ethan's room was. A small, circular spot, damp and discolored. Do you see that? I nudged Emily. She followed my gaze. Her breath caught. What is that? I grabbed a chair and climbed up, running my fingers over the spot. The drywall was cold. Not wet. Just, ice cold. That was when we heard it. A thump. Then another. Coming from above. From Ethan's room. Emily and I locked eyes. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Don't go up there, she whispered. But I had to. I swallowed hard and climbed down. Then, slowly, I made my way upstairs. Something was waiting for me. The hallway was dark. The air felt different, heavier, like the whole house was holding its breath. Ethan's door was open. I stepped inside. And there he was. Standing in the middle of his room. Not asleep. Not moving. Just standing there. His back was to me, his head tilted slightly to the side. Like he was listening. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. Ethan? He didn't answer. I stepped closer. Then I saw it. His fingers. They were moving. Not like he was scratching or fidgeting, but shifting, too fast, like something underneath his skin was twitching, trying to break free. My breath caught. My body screamed at me to run. Then, without warning, Ethan spoke. But his voice came from the ceiling. My whole body locked up. It was still his voice. But it wasn't coming from him. It was coming from above me. You shouldn't be in here, it whispered. I looked up. There was something in the dark stain on the ceiling. Something watching me. I stumbled backward, my pulse slamming against my ribs. Ethan, or whatever this was, turned his head toward me. His neck moved too slow, too smooth, like his bones weren't connected right. And then, he smiled. Not a real smile. A copy of a smile. Forced. Stretched. Like his skin didn't fit right. I ran. Emily was already packing. When I got downstairs, Emily was shoving things into a bag. We need to go, she said, voice shaking. I didn't argue. I grabbed my keys. My wallet. My phone. But when we reached the door, we froze. Ethan was standing there. Blocking our way. His head tilted, eyes wide. That same stretched out smile on his face. Where are we going? He asked softly. The house felt silent. Like the walls were listening. Emily's grip tightened on my arm. Move, honey, she said, forcing calm into her voice. Ethan didn't move. Then, slowly, his smile faded. His expression dropped. Completely blank. His voice was cold when he spoke. You can't leave. The hair on my arm stood up. For the first time in my life, I felt something I had never felt toward my son. Pure terror. Then he took a step forward. I grabbed Emily's hand. And we ran, Emily and I bolted out the front door, into the cold night air. The second we crossed the threshold, I felt lighter, like stepping outside had freed me from some invisible grip. We ran to the car, our feet pounding the driveway. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so hard I could barely shove them into the lock. Emily was crying, whispering, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," over and over. Finally, the key slid in. I yanked the door open, shoved her inside, and scrambled into the driver's seat. I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered. No. No, no, no. I turned the key again. Nothing. The car was dead. Then. Tap. 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 The sound came from Emily's window. She screamed. I turned, my stomach dropping. Ethan was standing there. Barefoot. In his pajamas. In the freezing cold. His face was blank. His head slightly tilted. He lifted his hand, his fingers curling in a slow, unnatural motion, and tapped the glass again. Tap. 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 I couldn't breathe. Then he leaned forward. His lips pressed against the glass, so close that I could see the fog of his breath. And in a voice that was too flat, too hollow, too wrong, he whispered, "Let me in." We had no choice. Emily was sobbing, curled in on herself, gripping my arms so tightly her nails dug into my skin. I turned the key again, praying, begging. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse and gunned it. The tires screeched as we flew backward down the driveway. I didn't look at Ethan. I couldn't. But in the rearview mirror, I saw something that nearly made me lose control of the car. He was still standing in the exact same spot. But his face. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was grinning. A wide, unnatural grin. And his mouth. It was too big. Like his skin was splitting at the corners. I looked away before I could see more. We hit the street, and I threw the car into drive. The tires skidded as I stomped the gas pedal. We sped off, leaving our house behind. Leaving him behind. But even as we drove, Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, shaking her head, whispering, "It's not over. It's not over." I didn't answer. Because deep down, I knew she was right that we didn't stop driving until we hit the next town. I had no idea where we were going, just that we needed to be anywhere but there. Emily was trembling in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. "I still feel it," she whispered. "Like it's watching." I didn't answer. My hands were clenched so tight on the wheel I thought my knuckles might snap. I didn't want to scare her more, but I felt it too. Something was wrong. The hotel room. We pulled into a small, roadside motel just before midnight. It was cheap, a little run-down, but I didn't care. The second we got inside, Emily collapsed onto the bed, shaking. I locked the door. Deadbolted. Pulled the curtains shut. Then I sank into a chair, gripping my head. My son, was still back in that house. Or, whatever was pretending to be him. I didn't know what to do. Call the police. Call the school. Tell them what, exactly? That my kid had turned into something else. That he didn't blink. That he had something inside of him. That his voice had spoken from the ceiling. They'd put me in a psych ward before they did anything. Emily sniffled. Do you think he's still there?" I hesitated. Then, quietly, I said, "I don't know." But I did. I knew. And I knew, this wasn't over. The call. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of Emily's phone buzzing on the nightstand. She was still asleep, curled up in the fetal position. I sat up groggily and grabbed the phone. Unknown caller. My stomach tightened. I answered. "Hello." Silence. Then. A small voice. Daddy? I froze. Ethan. His voice was quiet, shaking. Daddy, where are you? I gripped the phone tighter. Ethan. A soft sniffle. I'm scared. I woke up and you were gone. Mommy was gone. It's dark. My heart twisted. For a split second, I felt guilt. Maybe, we'd made a mistake. Maybe he was just sick. Maybe. Then, in the background, I heard it. A soft, wet scraping sound. Like nails dragging against wood. And then, a second voice. Right up against the speaker. Low. Garbled. Wrong. You can't run. The line went dead. The final moment. I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the nightstand, the screen still glowing. My pulse was hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. Emily stirred beside me. What's wrong? I turned to her. And then. Tap. 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 Our blood went cold. The sound came from the motel window. Slowly, we turned. Outside, standing inches from the glass, was Ethan. Or what looked like Ethan. His hands were pressed to the window, fingers twitching. His head was tilted at that same unnatural angle. And his mouth. His mouth was too wide. His lips stretched too far, curling at the edges like his skin was tearing. Then, he leaned in. And in that hollow, empty voice, he whispered. Let me in. Emily let out a choked sob. I lunged for the motel lamp, knocking it over in my panic. And in the split second that the room went dark, he was gone. I don't know what to do. That was 2 days ago. We haven't gone back. We haven't told anyone. We haven't slept. Because every time I close my eyes, I see him. Standing outside. Watching. Waiting. And I know. We can never go home.